What's up, guys? Today we're going over the Unloved, the Strand hand cannon from the dungeon, and I can say pretty confidently that this is maybe the worst named weapon ever. This thing's definitely not Unloved. This thing is really good. In this episode, just like the corrected measure with some artifact mods, I mean, this thing is truly just straight up an exotic right now. And this weapon's gonna be a heavy burst strand hand cannon, which means a 2-round burst that outputs a lot of damage. So starting off with the first roll, the one for Ehroar, looking at the perks, in the left there's going to be two choices, either Hatchling or Dragonfly. And I think for most situations, Dragonfly is just going to be better. I don't know if it's like cope or what, but the Strand Dragonfly seems to be a pretty big explosion. It's very noticeable of how large the radius is. I think if you were using a Strand build with the fragment to increase swirling damage, Hatchling could be a good perk. It could be like the way to go on some Strand Warlock builds. I'm thinking of like a Verities with all the different swirling veins in that build. Could be pretty good, but for the most part, you would just go with Dragonfly. Then in the right, there's going to be 4 damage perks you could use. Starting off with the one I think would be the least useful would be Kill Clip. Even though it's going to be a 25% buff, I do think Fair Casual Affinity would be better. It's going to be 20% and it's going to be a lot easier to get going. No need to reload or anything like that. And you could also use Elemental Honing, which I will be talking about in the second roll. So for Ehroar, I would just skip this. You can definitely use it for Ehroar. But the thing about those 3 damage perks is that this weapon has pretty low base reload speed. To the point where it's like super noticeable and you want something to help with reload. And that's why I would recommend just Frenzy 100% on this weapon. Once you have Frenzy procced, it will max out handling and reload speed. So it doesn't matter what your mag is, what your masterwork is. Once you have Frenzy going, you'll just have 100 reload speed on this weapon. And that is definitely necessary, because without that increase of reload speed, it is pretty slow. So overall, the roll I'd be going for Ehroar, the one I got, is just Dragonfly plus Frenzy. And you could keep a Hatchling plus Frenzy also for certain builds. And overall, just the feel of this weapon just feels really good once you have Frenzy going to help the reload speed. I have a roll with a lot of range, and I mean, it just feels like a laser beam, where I feel like even at range, I'm just consistently getting both shots in the burst to be headshots and not missing like the second one and stuff like that. So even though sometimes Dragonfly is not great on burst weapons, I've had no issue at all with it on this weapon. And then when we combine that with the origin trait Subjugation on the dungeon weapons for primaries is just absolutely wild. So for red bars, when you hit them, the shot will also explode into stronger health targets, so majors and bosses. They will become exhausted. So we look at damage of this explosive increase. Per burst, there's only going to be 1 explosion. And for headshots, it's going to be roughly a 6.2% increase to the weapon's damage. And for body shots, 13.6%, which is really nice. That's just straight up free damage. It's just a free perk on this weapon of explosive payload. And unlike explosive payload where it splits damage from the headshot and body shots into an explosion, this is just free on top of the already existing damage. So not only is it just straight up more damage, it also doesn't take away from proccing Dragonfly, in my opinion. I've never felt like I'm getting headshot final blows and it's not proccing Dragonfly because of this explosive damage. Since it's like coded it as a second thing, you still always proc Dragonfly on precision final blows. Then when you move over to a major mini boss, whatever it is, it'll become exhausted, which is kind of a similar term to sever, which will just reduce their outgoing damage. So on this weapon, we practically have 3 great S tier PvE perks at all times with Dragonfly, Frenzy, and Explosive Payload. But this season in the artifact, we can go even further. So starting off, we have Unraveling Orbs, where when we pick up an orb or a tangle, we'll get Strand Weapons Unraveling Rounds. Now you can also get this just through your subclass, either on Prismatic or Strand through melee final blows, but this obviously makes it a lot easier to maintain and get going. So we can get Unraveling Rounds for this weapon very easily. And the second artifact mod, Board Shuttle, where damaging unraveled targets with a weapon occasionally spawns a threadling. So now you pick up an orb, you pick up a tangle, or proc Unraveling Rounds through a fragment, and you'll just spread Unraveling all over the place, and when you do damage to those targets, they'll just constantly spawn in threadlings. So now, this season, we like truly have 5.5, almost 6 perks active on this weapon at all times. We have an AoE Ehroar perk of Dragonfly, we have a damage and reload perk of Frenzy, we have a free perk of Explosive Payload, or like a Slice/Tear perk, or the Exhaust. Then through the artifact, we have Unraveling Rounds, which is absolutely crazy on primaries. And then all the unraveling damage will spawn in redlings, kind of like hatchling. So I mean, yeah, I just don't know what else you want a primary to do. I mean, it just does everything. It does so much that you can't even tell what is going on. You have strain explosions from Dragonfly. You have unraveling rounds going everywhere. You have threadlings going everywhere. I mean, you just kind of shoot one lane. Next thing you know, everything's dead. It is absolutely wild. So moving on to the second role for a very different reason. This is going to be revolving around elemental honing. And the same role, you could use Dragonfly in the left, or you could run rapid hit since you're losing the reload benefit of Frenzy. And the point of using this instead is that elemental honing is a 35% buff once you do damage with 5 elements, which makes it the highest damage perk in the game that you can actually realistically get for bosses. Obviously, there are things that are higher, but they're all kill activations. So this is by far the highest damage buff that we can use for a boss fight on a 2-round burst hand cannon. And these hand cannons have always been great with Lucky Pants for DPS. So now the idea is to combine this with Lucky Pants for the greatly increased damage of the hand cannon when we ready it. And then with the Finality's Augur, almost using it like a Anarchy, just for the passive damage of the turret. So the idea is to spawn in the turret. Now we have bait and switch on the Catalyst, which does increase the damage of the turret. And once you paint them, obviously you'll hit them 6 times, roughly every 1.5 seconds. And now instead of just sitting there using the linear fusion, we swap over to our hand cannon and take advantage of Lucky Pants and do a lot of damage. And since we're using elemental honing, which I don't have one with, which is crazy how much I've played the dungeon, to proc all 5 stacks, we obviously have Solar and Strand. Then I usually like to use a Volt Shot Indebted to cover Arc and its Barrier and Overload. And then on Prismatic, we have Snare Bomb for Void. And this will also weaken the target. So our Finality's Augur damage is being buffed by Particle Reconstruction, which is almost 28%. But for our hand cannon damage, we want a debuff, and this will be 15% for that. And then the final element we need to cover is Stasis, and our only option is Dusk-Filled Grenade to get the full ×5 of elemental honing. And another thing is with our Snare Bomb, when we throw it and hit the boss, we will also proc Radiant with the Dawn Fragment. So we can give ourselves a buff and debuff at the same time with our Void melee. So now you would just create the turret, make sure to paint the target, proc bait and switch, throw your melee and your grenade, and you would just have every single thing going. And the final thing we could do is run triple strand weapon surge for a 22% buff to the unloved damage. And now looking at all the math, the Finality's Augur damage with bait and switch and particle. Like I said, it roughly takes 1.6 seconds per activation of the turret. And then looking at the damage of the unloved with Lucky Pants. Lucky Pants is a 45% buff per stack up to ×10 of 450%. You can shoot off 1 full mag with the perk. So the full combo with all the buff, debuffs, surges, all that stuff is going to be 205,000, which is obviously quite high just for a primary weapon. And using the Finality's Augur kind of like the Anarchy. And mousing through the rest of the build, everything else is kind of wherever you want. If you have a favorite Prismatic Hunter build you like to use, just use that. This is one I'm using. I will link it down below. It's kind of all about the Ascension class ability. Just another way to stun Overload and spread the Jolt, which feeds into our second aspect, which is Stylus Executioner to go invis. And overall, this build is really fun to use for champion gameplay in Lost Sectors or GMs or Nightfalls, wherever it is. You go into a room, set up the Finality's Augur turret. For 30 seconds, you just kind of paint wherever you need, which will help with ad clear and single target damage. The champion rolls up, you can stun Unstoppable with the Finality's Augur because it's a fusion this season. And then you can cover barrier either through the sidearm or if you have unraveling rounds for the unloved. And then for overload, you have the option of Volt Shot on the sidearm. Then in the same way, applying Jolt through Ascension works also. And a last resort option would be throwing your Dusk Field to slow them. So you can make this build work for all champion types. Then you ready the Unloved with Lucky Pants and just simply kill them in 1 mag. And that applies for champions and bosses for the most part, unless it's like a dungeon or raid boss. It is pretty good. And at the same time, this build is great for Actor. Just Unloved, let's say you're using Dragonfly plus Elemental Honing. Then with the free explosive payload and the unraveling rounds and hashling like effect with all of the threadlings. Yeah, I mean, this hand cannon alone is an entire build for Ackler. Anyways, that is the full hunter build, and yeah, Unloved is just really strong. It truly is one of the best feeling legendary primaries I've used in PvE in a very, very long time, if not ever. I mean, this season, it just feels amazing. Anyways, let me know what you think about this hand cannon down below. Like usual, thanks for watching. Catch you guys next time.